The grandfather clock in the corner of Lord Reginald Ashworth's bedchamber struck 10:30 as he settled himself beneath the heavy velvet coverlet, his breathing deliberately slow and measured. The fire in the marble hearth had burned low to glowing embers, casting dancing shadows across the ornate wallpaper that depicted hunting scenes from his ancestral estate. Outside, the London fog pressed against the tall windows like ghostly fingers, muffling the distant sounds of carriages clattering over cobblestones. Baron Ashworth was not asleep, though any observer would believe otherwise. His eyes remained closed, his chest rose and fell in the steady rhythm of slumber, and his hands lay still upon the embroidered counterpane. But beneath his composed exterior, his mind was sharp and alert, waiting. The new maid would arrive soon for her evening duties. Miss Charlotte Pemberton had been in his employ for merely a fortnight, recommended by his housekeeper, Mrs. Hartwell, with unusual enthusiasm. "A gentle soul, my lord," the older woman had declared, "raised in a vicarage in Yorkshire. Impeccable references, though she's never worked in such a grand house as Ashworth Manor before." The Baron had barely glanced at the girl during her brief interview, noting only her downcast eyes, the nervous trembling of her hands, and hair so fair it seemed almost silver in the lamplight. What had piqued his interest, however, were the whispered conversations among his household staff. The footmen spoke of missing trinkets found mysteriously returned to their proper places. The cook mentioned food disappearing from the pantry, only to discover elaborate meals prepared for the stray cats that haunted the mews. Most intriguingly, his valet Henderson had reported that the Baron's own clothes were being tended to with unusual care, stains removed that Henderson himself hadn't noticed, buttons tightened, small tears mended with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. All of this activity seemed to center around the times when the new maid worked alone in the upper floors. Baron Ashworth was a man accustomed to mystery and intrigue. His considerable fortune had been built not merely through inheritance, but through careful observation of human nature and the exploitation of secrets. He had made his mark in shipping and railways by knowing which competitors would falter before they knew it themselves, by reading the subtle tells in their behavior that betrayed their true circumstances. Now, at the age of 42, he found himself genuinely curious about this slip of a girl who moved through his house like a benevolent ghost. The soft whisper of fabric against would announce her arrival. The door opened with barely a sound. She had clearly learned the exact pressure required to prevent the ancient hinges from creaking. Baron Ashworth kept his breathing steady as footsteps so light they barely registered moved across the Persian carpet. Through his barely parted eyelashes, he watched her approach. Charlotte Pemberton moved with a grace that seemed at odds with her humble station. She wore the standard black dress and white apron of a housemaid, but somehow she made the uniform appear elegant rather than utilitarian. Her blonde hair was pinned back in a simple chignon, though rebellious strands had escaped to frame her face in the amber light of the oil lamp she carried. She set the lamp on his bedside table with infinite care, then stood perfectly still for a long moment, her green eyes studying his face. The Baron fought the urge to shift under her scrutiny, maintaining his facade of sleep through sheer force of will. Satisfied that he was truly unconscious, Charlotte began her work. But it was not the work Baron Ashworth had expected. Instead of the perfunctory dusting and tidying he anticipated, Charlotte moved to his writing desk near the window. She lifted papers with the delicacy of someone handling ancient manuscripts, her eyes scanning the contents. The Baron's pulse quickened. Was she a spy? An agent of his business rivals seeking to steal his correspondence? But then she did something that made his breath catch in his throat. She began to organize. Not with the careless efficiency of a servant completing a chore, but with the meticulous attention of someone who understood the importance of each document. She sorted his correspondence by date and subject, aligned his account ledgers with mathematical precision, and arranged his writing instruments in order of frequency of use. More remarkably, she seemed to grasp the content of what she was organizing, placing related documents together, flagging items that required urgent attention with small scraps of paper marked in a careful copperplate hand. The Baron watched in fascination as she moved to his bookshelf. His collection was extensive and had grown somewhat haphazard over the years, with volumes shelved wherever space could be found. Charlotte studied the titles with the intensity of a scholar, then began a careful reorganization. Philosophy with philosophy, history with history, but more than that, she was arranging them by subject matter within each category, creating connections that even Baron Ashworth himself had not considered. When she reached for a leather-bound volume of Shakespearean sonnets, she paused, opening it carefully. Her lips moved silently as she read, and the Baron saw her face transform. The nervous, downcast expression she wore during daylight hours melted away, replaced by something approaching rapture. She was not merely literate. She was educated, cultured, her appreciation for the verse evident in every line of her posture. She closed the book reluctantly and returned it to its newly proper place, but not before pressing it gently against her chest, as if embracing an old friend. The Baron's mind raced. Who was this woman? No vicarage upbringing, however genteel, could account for the depth of learning she was displaying. Her movements spoke of someone familiar with fine things, comfortable in elegant surroundings despite her obvious nervousness around the household staff. Charlotte moved next to his wardrobe, and Baron Ashworth nearly gasped aloud at what he witnessed. She examined his clothes with the eye of a master tailor, spotting imperfections that had escaped both his notice and Henderson's. A loose thread was trimmed with tiny scissors she produced from her apron pocket. A barely visible stain on his favorite waistcoat received treatment from a small vial of cleaning solution she carried. She worked with the focused intensity of an artist, transforming maintenance into something approaching art. But it was when she approached his bedside that Baron Ashworth truly froze. Charlotte stood beside him for a long moment, her breathing soft and even. The scent of lavender and something uniquely her own reached him, and he had to concentrate to maintain his steady, sleeping rhythm. Then, with infinite gentleness, she reached out and adjusted his coverlet. The simple gesture was executed with such tenderness that it took the Baron's breath away. She tucked the blanket more securely around his shoulders, her touch as light as a whisper against the fabric. When she noticed that his hair had fallen across his forehead, she hesitated for a long moment before very carefully, with just the tip of her finger, brushing it back into place. The touch was so brief, so gentle, that it might have been imagined. But Baron Ashworth felt it like a brand against his skin. Charlotte stepped back, her hands clasped before her, and studied his sleeping form with an expression that the Baron could not quite decipher. There was no impropriety in her gaze, nothing forward or presumptuous. Instead, there was something that looked almost like concern, affection, the kind of careful attention one might give to a beloved but fragile thing. She moved to the fireplace next, and the Baron watched through slitted eyes as she coaxed the dying embers back to life with practiced skill. She added coal with the precision of someone who understood exactly how much heat would be needed to keep the room comfortable through the night without becoming stifling. The flames caught and danced, sending warm light across the room and chasing away the evening chill. As she worked, Charlotte began to hum, so softly that it was barely audible, but the melody reached Baron Ashworth's ears like a lullaby. The tune was hauntingly beautiful, something classical that spoke of sophisticated musical education. Her voice, though kept to a whisper, was pure and true, with the kind of natural grace that could not be taught. When the fire was burning steadily, she turned her attention to the room itself. But again, her ministrations went far beyond the expected. She moved through the space like a curator in a museum, adjusting the position of objects with an eye for harmony and balance. A book was moved slightly to catch the firelight better. A small statue was turned to show its best angle. The heavy curtains were adjusted to block the drafts from the windows while still allowing the room to breathe. Every movement was considered, purposeful, as if she were creating a sanctuary rather than simply tidying a bedchamber. Baron Ashworth found himself holding his breath as she approached his bedside once more. This time, she paused beside the small table where he kept his personal effects. Her eyes fell upon a miniature portrait of his late mother, a delicate painting that had been damaged years ago when a careless housemaid had knocked it to the floor. Charlotte lifted the portrait with reverence, studying the crack that ran across the painted face. Then, from her seemingly endless supply of tools hidden in her apron, she produced what appeared to be fine brushes and a small palette of paints. Working by lamplight with the steady hands of a master restorer, she began to repair the damage. The Baron watched in amazement as the crack disappeared under her skilled ministrations. She worked with the concentration of someone for whom such tasks were not unusual, her technique speaking of formal training in the arts. When she finished, the portrait looked as it had when first painted, his mother's gentle smile restored to its original beauty. Charlotte set the portrait back in its place, then stood back to admire her work. The satisfaction on her face was unmistakable, the quiet pride of someone who had made something broken whole again. But it was her next action that shattered Baron Ashworth's carefully maintained composure. Charlotte returned to his bedside and, after a moment's hesitation, sank into the chair beside it. From her apron, she produced a small, leather-bound book and opened it carefully. By the lamplight, she began to read, but not silently. In a voice barely above a whisper, she began to recite poetry. The verses were in French, Baudelaire, the Baron realized with shock. The words flowed from her lips like music, her accent perfect, her intonation revealing not just linguistic skill but deep understanding of the poet's meaning. She read as if the words were a prayer, a benediction offered to the sleeping room. But there was something else in her voice, something that made Baron Ashworth's chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. There was loneliness there, a profound solitude that spoke of someone who had lost much and found solace only in the company of books and the quiet satisfaction of caring for others. As she read, her eyes occasionally moved to his face, as if checking to ensure that her soft voice was not disturbing his rest. In those moments her expression was so tender, so protective, that the Baron felt something crack inside his chest. This woman, this mysterious creature who moved through his house like a guardian angel, was watching over him with the devotion of someone who genuinely cared for his well-being. When she finished the poem, Charlotte closed the book and sat quietly for several minutes, simply watching him sleep. The Baron could feel her gaze like a physical presence, warm and comforting in a way he hadn't experienced since childhood. Finally, she rose from the chair and moved through the room one last time, ensuring everything was perfect. She dimmed the lamp to a soft glow that would provide enough light should he wake in the night but not enough to disturb his sleep. She checked the fire once more, adjusted the curtains, and straightened a final few items. As she prepared to leave, Charlotte paused at the foot of his bed. For a long moment she simply stood there, her hands clasped before her, looking at him with an expression of such gentle affection that it took all of Baron Ashworth's considerable self-control not to open his eyes and demand answers. Then, so softly that he almost missed it, she whispered, "Sleep well, my lord. May your dreams be peaceful." The door closed behind her with the same careful silence with which she had entered, leaving Baron Ashworth alone with his thundering heart and 1,000 questions burning in his mind. He lay still for a long time after she left, staring up at the ceiling and trying to process what he had witnessed. This was no ordinary housemaid, no simple country girl seeking employment in London. Charlotte Pemberton was a puzzle wrapped in an enigma, a woman of obvious education and refinement masquerading as a servant. But why? What circumstances had brought someone of her evident culture and capability to work as a maid in his household? And more importantly, why did she tend to him with such evident care, as if his well-being mattered to her personally? The Baron rose from his bed and moved to the writing desk she had so carefully organized. Her system was not just efficient, it was inspired. She had created order from chaos in a way that revealed genuine intelligence and an understanding of his business affairs that was frankly astounding. He moved to the bookshelf next, running his fingers along the spines of volumes now arranged with obvious thought and care. The organization revealed a mind that saw connections and patterns, that understood the relationships between ideas across disciplines. At his bedside table, He lifted the restored portrait of his mother, marveling at the skilled repair work. The painting looked exactly as it had in his childhood, before years and accident had taken their toll. But it was the lingering scent of lavender and the echo of French poetry that affected him most profoundly. Charlotte had transformed his bedchamber from merely a place to sleep into something approaching a sanctuary, a space infused with care and attention that went far beyond the requirements of her position. Baron Ashworth found himself facing a realization that shook him to his core. For the first time in his adult life, he had been genuinely cared for. Not served, not attended to by paid staff fulfilling their duties, but truly cared for by someone who seemed to find joy in ensuring his comfort and peace. The question that haunted him as he finally settled back into bed was simple but profound. Who was Charlotte Pemberton, and what was he going to do about the fact that he was already half in love with her? As sleep finally claimed him, Baron Ashworth's dreams were indeed peaceful, filled with the sound of gentle humming and the whisper of French poetry in the darkness. But beneath the peace lay a growing determination to solve the mystery of his extraordinary maid, and perhaps, if fortune favored him, to discover whether the tender care she showed him might some day grow into something deeper. The test had revealed far more than he had bargained for, and Baron Reginald Ashworth found himself, for the first time in years, genuinely uncertain about what the morning might bring.